I received instructions to start on time. Being of Dutch origin, I like the Swiss or the Japanese, I should say as well, timely and precise. I'm Bartha Maria Knoppers, co-chair with Rodrigo, who's seated right over there, of the ethics working group of the HCA. I have our coordinator here with us, Emily, and our chief data officer, if I could call him that, Alexander Bernier, Emily Kirby and Alexander Bernier. So that's where you can send all your questions to now that explain who's responsible. So what we decided to do is to introduce you to some things that are happening on the periphery that don't have the word cell or biology in them. International in particular, so it affects everyone. Regulatory developments that we think will directly, perhaps in a positive way, support the Human Cell Atlas and what we can and cannot do moving forward, or could have a chilling effect in terms of data sharing in the future. So I'm going to go like a kaleidoscope, like ding, 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 to what look like different developments from different agencies, and then say, open it up. These are not the only issues that you could think about. We want to hear from you, not only for planning purposes, but also what you think about these approaches. So some positive news. Let's start with that. Never mind the title and whatever. This is a very, very, very recent case where, as you know, under the General Data Protection Regulation, if you fall under that, you're considered a person for all the rules that apply to identification, de-identification, coding, anonymization, and so on, and how we can share data in the open access database of the HCA, and how we are now going to be creating this managed access or controlled access process. So here's a company who collected responses, coded it, and so on, and shared it. And one of the complaints was that they were sharing personal data under the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. Because if it's not personal data, then the GDPR doesn't apply. Finally, a European data protection supervisor who handled the case decided that synonymized data, that's a European term, ordinary people just say coded data, shared by one party with another, will not be considered personalized if the person who receives it doesn't have any legal means of trying to go back and re-identify. Either it's been coded so many times with all the different techniques that you know about, or they signed a legal contract that they won't try to re-identify the original source of the data. So this is a tremendously important decision. We'll have to see if this holds. Then the last 6 years of debate, every meeting, a hand goes up. What if someone tries to de-identify, to re-identify, sorry, by putting together, the Mormon database in Utah with the FinGen database up there, and with the Qatar biobank database, and so on. You always get these hypothetical issues. So this is a very good, hopefully this will hold in terms of when you are a person or not under the GDPR. Legally, if you can't re-identify, then you're not. The GDPR does not apply.
What does legal mean actually?
What's the what?
Legal means. What do you mean by legal means?
Well, that's common. If a person's use illegal means, then obviously, that
legal means just
legal
means
illegal.
Okay.
People may try to do things illegally. That is obviously a criminal act or whatever, and will not be condoned as being a proper way of protecting privacy. Yeah, but maybe you want to say.
I mean, it's basically exactly what you just said. When they perform the analysis of whether there's a risk of re-identification or not, they only look at methods that are likely to be used. So if it's, if there would be a way of re-identifying someone, but it's extremely cost intensive, they don't look at that, right? If you're like, oh, I could cross-reference, 16 genomic databases with voter information and so on and so forth, they won't look at that because it's too onerous, and they won't look at most means that are illegal, right? So if, you say like, oh, I could, break into a database that's available and start getting data about this person, cross-reference that, they won't take that into consideration.
All right, so one piece, another, and this only happened on Monday. This actually, that question mark is no longer a question. It was signed between the EU and the US. The Transatlantic Data Privacy Framework was signed, which means, but good news, but it's only for commercial transfers. So what about the public sector? What about the institutes, universities, researchers, and so on outside of the commercial sector? What influence will this agreement? It largely had to do with surveillance techniques and the possibility for individuals to have recourse in one area or the other. So the US is now considered adequate for commercial transfers in terms of privacy protections. So it's sort of good news, but it doesn't really help us, except maybe the philosophy or the understanding or the different elements that went into the negotiation of this framework can also eventually, hopefully, be applied to the public sector as well. There's also, now that the UK and the Brexit, there's also a separate bridge being proposed for the UK, and the UK already has an adequacy, has already been considered adequate by the EU in terms of its protection. So this is a slow movement towards mutual, what we call mutual recognition of adequacy of privacy protections. This is one of my favorites, the EU Data Governance Act, in terms of how across the different countries that make up the EU, data can be recognized and shared, even sensitive data. And what's good about this Governance Act, it's the first time legally, at least in legal documents, that I've seen the term data altruism. That is unique in the sense that there's a recognition that individuals, patients, research participants who voluntarily give their data to public endeavors, including COVID research and cell research and genetic research and so on, are recognized under an act. So never seen this before. It's always data privacy, it's always autonomy. This is a new term. There's also a data health space regulation, which hopefully when it goes into effect will compel electronic health data to make certain holdings, not the whole medical file, available if it can be used in a secure and transparent manner, and the EU Data Act. So these are all positive developments that will trickle down and have a hopefully benefit greater data sharing in the human cell atlas. Now this you're all aware of. What does this have to do with human cell atlas? Well, many researchers, as we saw on the slides in the last 2 days, were very much involved in the analyzing the COVID pandemic. And this treaty is currently under discussion. It is probably the greatest challenge that the WHO has ever faced, getting this treaty adopted. Why? Because it has, in a prospective way for the next pandemic, a certain amount of data sharing in limiting patentability of everything by everyone for everything, in the sense that 20% of pandemic-related products would be allocated to the WHO for equitable distribution. You say, okay, well, that's products. What's that got to do with human cell atlas? Well, there's also waivers in there of intellectual property rights, potential waivers of intellectual property rights, such as limited royalties, non-exclusive licensing, and so on. So WHO recognizes that IP has its proper place, intellectual property, sorry, IP has its proper place. And even the right to science recognizes attribution, recognition of what we call moral interests of innovators like yourself, scientists and so on. But at the same time, we saw in the COVID pandemic what happens if you have monopolies over vaccines, and there's not the sharing that's necessary in a pandemic situation to encourage patent holders to waive or manage appropriately payment or royalties. This is really important because universities really push you. They push you early when the grants come through. At least I'm just talking about my experience, to immediately, decide future patentability. 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 is often the way that it works, and without any flexibility in the contracts and so on that are signed for possible waiver or different kinds of models for data sharing. This looks even further removed from the Human Cell Atlas. But there was an agreement signed in 2022 known as the Nagoya Agreement Protocol on biological diversity. It was for plants and animals. And the Human Genome Project at that time asked them specifically, does it include humans? They said no. And the Nagoya Protocol has been very controversial because it mandates benefit sharing. And what is benefit sharing and so on and so on. What does this have to do with us? Well, there is under the new biodiversity framework, subject to the Nagoya, there is a concept called digital sequence information. And the question now is, if there is this benefit sharing ethos or law between countries on animals and plants in terms of digital sequence information sharing, does it include pathogen data? And if so, what happens to that kind of sharing in terms of getting equitable sharing, but also benefits back? And pathogens, as you know, in terms of viral data and so on, are particularly important during pandemics and in general for understanding, including climate change, by the way. And pharma is already, even though it's not specifically supposed to apply to humans, calling for an immediate and unhindered pathogen sharing through a public health exemption. So this public health, this data altruism, this pandemic model coming from completely different sources is definitely going to be influencing the future sharing in the Human Cell Atlas. Now, most of you already have such a policy. I know Canada does, and you're aware that the NIH has now mandated that scientists should establish plans in your grant application, how you're going to collect data, manage data, and share data, and put it also in the public domain in terms of a bit like we do for clinical data, and requires the deposit of data in suitable digital repositories. Will HCA and its various networks and repositories be considered a suitable digital repository for future applications by HCA scientists? That's very, very important for you to get your grants, that be the case. And your funding, in fact, will be dependent on it. And you have to report in, not just saying, yes, 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 I'm going to do it all, and then you get your money and run. This is, there's monitoring of this as well. And finally, or second to final, end, there was discussion yesterday, for sure. However, this EU Artificial Intelligence Act, the international discussions at UNESCO and so on artificial intelligence, AI, and use of software, use of being able to be transparent, be safe, be monitored, will affect. We already saw on all the slides a lot of application of AI, even in the cell research community. And I'm sure that Alex can answer all your questions on this. This is not my field, so if there are questions on this, they'll all go to Alex Bernier over there. And then last, this is one of my favorites. By the way, the United States just rejoined UNESCO yesterday. just to let you know, they're back in after a 7 or 8 year hiatus, I think it is. That's really very positive news. And why? Because this recommendation on open science is really worth reading. If you're in an airport and you're stuck, go to this. It's had a lot of international consultation. UNESCO, as you know, has offices in different countries around the world. And so it had a lot of input. It wasn't just a small body that decides something and then proclaims it. It also balances legitimate IP, intellectual property, copyright, attribution, recognition with open science. Because the right to science, as it was stated even in the 1948 Universal Declaration, is both the right to benefit, everyone to benefit from science, which is why we're doing what we're doing, but also the right to be recognized for innovation. It's in the same article, so they're not opposites. They're twins, like they're mosaic twins, maybe not, or like twins. But the point is, this argument, this constant binary approach, patents are bad, personal data is mine, and all that kind of stuff, does not work under open science. It's a different concept. It's extremely well written, and countries are slowly recognizing the importance of open science. So how can we continue to advance open science principles? So that's really the latest around the world sort of regulatory tour. But I wanted to ask Roderick, if in addition to all these, I mean, a lot of it sounds like legal gobbledygook to you, but it really does end up being translated into university policies and limitations and privacy commissioners and so on. So I thought it was important to let you know what's happening out there, kind of legally speaking, or ethically speaking, to be aware of. So do you want to add some?
I mean, of course, I am not so familiar as you are with all the legal issues around the world, but I think that what I think it's important for us is to evaluate whether any of the things and to anticipate whether any of, I guess that's the reason why we're actually letting us know about all these new regulations, to anticipate whether any of these things will have an impact on the human cell others, so that we can anticipate the ethical issues that we will need to address. So, for instance, I don't know, in the case of the Nagoya and the benefit sharing, so how would this be? How could this? What could be the translation of this? I think for the Nagoya Protocol and the biodiversity genomics is quite clear, right? So you contribute with data from your area, because you make this data publicly available. But in return, if people are using this data from other areas, you will get some benefit. I think that's the idea behind the benefit sharing. I think. So, would this impact on the human cell? This idea of benefit sharing, so do you think that would have an impact on the human cell?
Well, my immediate comment, and then I'll pass the mic around, is that the problem with benefit sharing is it's limited interpretation. It was originally raised by the Human Genome Organization in its statement on benefit sharing in, I think, 2000 or 2002, and it had a list of what benefit sharing could mean. A lot of epidemiological basic studies. They're not testing drugs. They're mapping, right? They're creating atlases. They're creating public benefit tools for the future of medical translation. And so when benefit sharing gets limited to a share of benefits of a product or of a treatment or a device, then it really defeats the multiplicity of meanings that benefit sharing could have. The HCA, for instance, sent a letter of thank you, and if a clinic was being used, they would pay the rent on the clinic for recruiting in different countries. They would pay it as a community center afterwards. But the HCA wasn't producing drugs, devices, or products, were no benefits except knowledge for the international community. And same with the 1000 genomes map, and same with the pan-genome reference consortium map that they're building, and same with our maps. So if you get the Nagoya applied literally, like with, you know, organic, some, let's say moisture resistant plant, I don't know why you have such a plant, but never mind, and you would get a split of the royalties over there. I have a hard time seeing for the Cell Atlas, which is a resource and infrastructure science effort, how beneficiary from Nagoya could really harm more than it could do.
Question online?
Yes, oh, online, go ahead. Is it Fabiana?
Hello, good morning, everybody.
Hi.
But I just thinking about the open science principles, which I agree to them completely. But haven't you thought that maybe with those principles and all the activities we are undertaking to facilitate the open access are making a transfer to the owners of the artificial intelligence technologies, which most there are no more than 20 companies being owners of artificial intelligence technologies. So we are talking about flexibility on intellectual property and licensing and, well, all the flexibilities to open science and to open the DNA sequences for research for the benefits of science, but indirectly, aren't we transferring all that open information to those companies that own artificial intelligence in the next 10 years, they will dominate all this spectrum of the knowledge?
I have a strong position on this issue, and it's probably slightly controversial. And I think it's sort of a mythological idea that investing data with rights, be they intellectual property rights, individual rights, or other, will stop monopolies from being entrenched in AI development. And one of the first reason for that is that it's incredibly cost intensive to navigate the transaction costs of gaining access to data, figuring out who has rights, how you can discharge them, how you can negotiate access to those rights. So that's reason number one. And the second reason is that creating these forms of rights and these sorts of regimes tends to advantage entrenched monopolists that provide infrastructure and larger organizations. The first reason for that is that networked organizations, be they communities or universities or others, they need to work together towards gaining access to data and using it. But the costs of cooperation are very high. So the actually discharging those individual rights and data becomes a lot more onerous when you're working across 10 different jurisdictions than if you're one central organization. The second reason is that organizations, be they the classic players, Google, Facebook, other, that have access to troves and troves of proprietary data, they already have that information. So if we put a lot of restrictions on data that right now falls in the commons, we're only, I think, preventing smaller organizations from participating in the use of data at all. And I don't think we're meaningfully combating existing information. I think it's self-defeating. That would have been a much quicker and more concise answer.
That's a politician's answer now. There were questions here right behind you. Go ahead, please. Thank you, Fabiana.
I have two questions and excuse if it's already been covered and I missed it. Independent of what you presented. It's independent of your presentation.
Okay, sure.
Today. So well, maybe part of the presentation. One is in the agreements that are happening, it's usually I'm seeing it's like global north, so Europe, Asia, Philippines, United States. I'm not hearing about low and middle income countries that may or may not get into the UNESCO agreement either. And I'm not asking for your I just want to know what that context is. I do a lot of work in those spaces. Of course, the samples are coming to me. We have MTAs, we have agreements, it's open use, but I don't even know if it's supposed to, like, is that what they will eventually decide on as actual entity as a space. And then another thing that's happening that I didn't capture so far here is that we've been, like my lab and some other labs have been inferring ancestry from single cell sequences. So inference identified. Is that something that's like, well, how are you going to manage that in terms of share? Yes, to this conversation, it was about sharing raw data. And the limitations to that type of sharing in terms of not identifying people directly, but just the inference of the ancestry, which was not necessarily indicated at the time that they could do related to that. But I don't not do my DNA from the single cell sequence to share.
I think I'll give that one to Emily.
So I can try the first question. So yes, I agree that a lot of what we discussed are like data transfer to UK, US, and I suspect, I mean, a lot of the other transfers would be countries that may not have sort of the whole system in place, the legal system in place, to think about all these questions. Is that your question?
Yeah, and is it so even if they, or maybe they have things in place, but maybe it's not on your radar. So is the onus on us to tell them like, hey, are y'all thinking about this?
I think so. So we talked about the access tiers. I think the ideal, again, the HCA is the open access, and I think that a lot of the tools in the ethics toolkit were geared towards bridging that gap, right? Where so data should go into the Atlas open access. However, again, because we don't know that map, we don't know necessarily there's like, not that they're not on our radar, but there's so many considerations. It's such a patchwork, especially privacy is so different between countries. The idea is to have this sort of conversation ongoing, but in the meantime, have a tier. We call it controlled access. We talked about GDPR, all of those big regulatory questions. However, it is also a space that can accommodate other question marks that we're not sure whether they can come in, MTs, DTAs. So it might be that some countries that are not on the radar do need some tweaks to how sharing data hopefully in that space while we learn more. Definitely knowledge gathering is important to us. There are issues with MTAs, DTAs, and for regions, countries that are not on our radar. I think it's important for our community to know and to map that. Does that address something?
I mean,
It's from the ethics perspective. I think there's like 20 percentages too. Question?
How to do with inference?
Ancestry, inference. Yeah, I think this is a cross question between
Yeah.
the equity, so and the GMT, right?
yeah, diversity network.
From an ethics perspective, what I heard yesterday is that there are some considerations as to the data. Some of the raw sequence data cannot be not surprising. And inference of data then from that data. My inkling would be that it might be a metadata question in terms of what level of information can you actually include without it being raw sequence data. And I think there's disagreement on standards of how we actually do that. I don't have a technical answer to that. I'm not sure I pinpoint what the exact ethics question is, but I think we need to figure out.
Yeah, so it's less technical and more ethical of so let me give you an example of what happens in our set. So I'm in Miami. I do a lot of work in the global south, like literal global south, and then spaces like in the United States and minoritized populations that may or may not trust completely all the things that we see with it. So we'll go into the clinic and we'll be like, Mrs. Joe, we have did this study on single cell. We'd like to collect your tissue that you're already undergoing a procedure for. Can we have a piece? they say, I mean, we ask them, can we also get a viral blood? Tissue but not the blood. So then we ask, can we get saliva? And sometimes they say yes, and sometimes they say no. When they say yes for the saliva, not the blood, we ask them why, we know why already, but we ask them why, and it just gives us a different answer. Or like the blood is precious, it's there is a cultural context with the blood and all the other things that we might be thinking that's happening with the blood. So the cells really, and what we can do. Also, it's their DNA. So they don't want their DNA out there. However, obviously, there's blood in the tissue, there's blood in there's DNA in all the cells. And forming specifically says we have to do that in theory, that you're consenting for us to study your DNA and RNA. Or else we can't do anything with it, or looking at it for itself. And so that's what I mean when it's about ethics. And in the context of, like, I don't remember who Mrs. Jo is by her, the identified number, but I'm going to infer her ancestry from the RNA that she has. Not necessarily explicitly said she doesn't want to give me her DNA. I mean, she just said not blood, right? So we can infer that. So how? For me, we're doing it. We're not doing it in the virus with consent, but it's just like generally speaking. What is the what are we?
Yeah.
If we just ignore that aspect of DNA versus tissue and having the information out there, when we can infer it from something, not perfectly, but enough that we can tell where people are from.
I think there's different levels to that question. There's individual consent, and individual preference, and that's not something, right? I think there's a level also of population consideration that's populational consent, especially in populations where it's going to be more sensitive. Historically, we know that. And I think the info we can provide models and suggestions on how to word the consent form, but I don't think we know how it's understood.
Yeah.
And why people refuse, individual people refuse the blood. That's an individual decision, it's not the consent process. Populationally wise, I think, however, that's the discussion to be had.
Excuse me, could you guys talk without the microphone? The audio is gargly. The room's
Oh, okay.
is better.
Can you hear me better
Yeah.
now? Yeah, okay,
Yes.
so we'll stop.
Okay, we didn't know that.
I think there's ensuing. So population level, I think this is where the discussion can be had on how to do it best. The model we have now is controlled access, right? And saying if there are large populational sensitivities that the blood, the DNA cannot go, or single cell data in this case, cannot go into public open access because there are still reluctances, I think that can be captured and explained. But the individual level is something I think we can control.
There were other hands up while we're getting more questions. Roderick, I just remembered something. South Africa actually has legislation saying no to benefit sharing in human genetic studies, because the rationale for saying no to whatever comes out 10, 15 years later and never comes out in terms of products, devices, things that have money attached to them. They were scared that it would be an inducement to participate. People would think, oh, good, I can, just like we prohibit selling of kidneys and so on, the non-commercialization of the human body and knowledge derived therefrom, they wanted it excluded from benefit sharing in case people thought that they were genetically interesting and wanted to be paid for contributing tissues or blood. Now, was there another hand up? John, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was curious about it feels like we're definitely moving towards the model where more of the data is going to be deemed personally identifiable, even counter matrices. I mean, many long conversations about this, but it's moving together with all the other information, physiology, etc., and the larger models, where that data is probably going to be deemed identifiable at some point. How as a community, do we think about that? We also have to think that that summarized data also has to be managed access at some point as we move forward, because we tried to get away with, we argued, I think pretty convincingly, that that was really hard in iteration one of the GDPR discussions. If that is no longer the case, does something like HCA have to think about the count data itself, the summarized data also being under some degree of managed access?
Well, I mean, science is about generalizable knowledge. You know, it's not your individual diagnosis and whatever ailment you have as a human person. It would almost defeat the whole purpose of science, which is generalizable knowledge, which means you need a lot of participation, a lot of data to make it generalizable and as representative as possible. So the language used right now to get away from what if one day somewhere someone does something and then someone will be identifiable, you don't make policy for the worst case scenario. You make policy for how to frame responsibly the current expressions used, the reasonable likelihood that someone will be re-identifiable. So being the reasonable in the context, determined in the context, or the latest one, is there a serious possibility that someone will be re-identifiable? Because otherwise you're open to, you know, the futuristic prospects of some 14-year-old genius somewhere doing something. So that's the language, the filter language, legal filter language being used right now to ask, have you thought about your database? Is there a serious possibility of re-identification? Is there a reasonable likelihood in considering the context and the circumstances? And that's called what the law uses as, you know, like the reasonable curves. And they have all these filter wiggle terms. Sorry, but that's what they are. Is it wriggle or wiggle? I'm not sure. Anyway, that's the current filter to address your concern. And I think that's all we can, unless you have something to add to that.
I think that, I mean, we had so many discussions on it's specific to a certain piece of legislation.
Yep.
Unfortunately, Alex left, so I'm not sure. I left the discussion at some point he picked up, and I'm not sure where it fell specifically related to GDPR note. However, I would tend to agree with the one which is reasonable likelihood. And I think that plus, as much as possible, moving forward, making sure that your explanation to participants and consents are strong in explanation of open for prospective and future data collections. I think that sort of counterbalances philosophically the fact that one day someone may work on trying to piece all the pieces together. I think, again, legally speaking, strictly speaking, like what article are we using?
Yeah, and in a way, cells are safer, if I can put it that way, not to be reassuring, unnecessarily reassuring. In the genetics community, we've been having this for a long time, at this genetic exceptionalism, they call it. And what if you find out something about, you know, one of these rare diseases or not, that means your family is at risk, and all these kinds of things that haunted a lot of international genetic projects for a long time. But now that genetics is entering what we call genomic medicine, precision medicine, the HCA cell knowledge is doing, maybe it'll be normalized because it'll be integrated into health. It'll be part of health. I need a blood test, I need a urine test, I need a genetic test, I need a scan, I need this. Might be 10 years away from today, but I'm increasingly convinced that the oddity or the potential stigmatization or re-identification issues will disappear as we get used to the idea of genetics being part of normal human condition. It's so maybe same with cell types or susceptibility or resistance and all the rest of it. But I'm a positive thinker.
So isn't that the concept of that data altruism overcome some of these issues, data altruism? So my understanding is that data altruism means that there is no concern by the data donor about the danger of being identified, correct?
There is governance, though. There is governance. You just don't throw your data into the willy-nilly.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why you have data access committees. That's why you have monitoring. That's why you have reporting. You have accountability. It's not a free-for-all. that's the way we want to have the cell atlas to be. Put it that way.
It's something that could be actually interesting to concept in the consents, right? Saying this is that data algorithm. Because at this point, I think people understand data, like putting your data online, putting your data there, so global understanding of what the, maybe explaining what altruism with regards to data is something that
I think that this thing has a positive meaning, and actually,
although there are risks, altruism is something that I understand.
It's new. It's 2 years or something, and it's the first time I've seen it. What's interesting in the preamble, whatever it is, to the European Data Governance Act, there's actually a statement that mirrors that data altruism as open as possible, as closed as necessary. If you could, it's like a slogan, but so it's good to remember because that's it. It says everything, doesn't it? It really does. We're also interested, by the way, knowing what you want us to do. What are issues that you think we should be addressing, or that we haven't addressed yet, or that you think are of interest to HCA in your work, where the ethics working group can start looking at. We get questions on the ethics help desk from particular projects, but are there particular issues now?
So as we talk about foundational models, or HCA potentially being one of the deliverables, I would like to understand if there are any ethical implications about how those foundational models are constructed, and if we have to be able to remove individual or have the ability to easily remove individuals from such foundational models.
You'll have to explain what you mean by foundational models.
Okay, so a foundational model in the AI sense is something like ChatGPT. So a foundational model where it just takes all of the data, it looks for patterns, and then you're able to query it. One of the things that HCA will think about in the next few years is such a foundational model. So you can imagine saying, well, I've got all of this information. I now want to imagine what would happen if I perturbed this cell type. Would I be able to predict what's going to happen over there? Is there a new cell type that I've never seen? And that would be best served by fitting across the whole corpus. So I would like to understand if there are any ethical issues there, and in particular, what the constraints are, if there are any, on if at some point someone requests their data to be removed from such a foundational model, whether you have to retrain, which could be extraordinarily expensive because it could cost tens of millions of dollars to fit such a model computationally. And is that something that we have to think about, or something that we can not worry about as a community?
I mean, that's a super question. The immediate answer, if now that I sort of understand what foundational models are, the immediate answer would be is that in most consent forms, as a sort of precautionary measure, they've already put in there, you can withdraw your data and your tissues or whatever at any time, unless it's already been processed or used in research or sent to other labs and used by other labs. So they have that caveat in already warning people that once it's used and exploited and out there, they can't withdraw.
Unlike static analysis, you can continue querying that data. So a new person.
Oh, that's right, you're right. Or it will, if you can find it, you can't promise to not continue using it. You can do it with tissues and samples, like the physical tissues and samples. You will no longer, share it with colleagues or use it or whatever, and you'll simply destroy it. That also is found in consent forms, but I haven't, seen the sort of search and rescue operation that you're describing anywhere possible. Unless.
So John, one question. So John, so essentially the data that's open access or even control access, if it could be used by others to build these foundational models, right? It's not something that, so you are suggesting that we should set limits to what others can do with the data, because these foundational models can be built by the HCA, but could be built by anybody, right? That has access to the data. So the discussion here is whether, as HCA, we should have put limits or warnings. And when now when you submit a paper, they ask you whether ChatGPT has helped you to write the paper, and you have to declare. Is that something that this isn't what you were thinking in the conditions under which these models can be the data can be used to build these models?
I think the challenge is, so with an academic, with a paper previously, if you reanalyze the data, it was out there, it was fine because the data was just kind of there, and then of course you would
In the public
reanalyze that.
domain,
But
yeah.
the problem with the querying is that if the data remains in the foundational model, you will continue querying a foundational model for a new question, even though it's present there, and it's a new question. It's not just the same as taking the existing data and looking at that and reanalyzing what's already public. It's asking something new, I guess, directly of the data. I just don't know if there's a second.
New vis-a-vis the original premise on which the foundational model was built. Is that's what you're saying? That's what's new about this question? Because reusing, reinventing, reinterpreting is endless. I mean,
Well, it's just. What am I thinking?
so, John, well, I'm sure that Emily has understood it, even if I haven't, but well, I get where you're going with this. It's one step beyond the current re-identification debate that you're considering the new tools and algorithms and chat and so on. So that's, I think you had a question, Ed. It's already answered. So we will get back to you probably with some more questions, but Emily, you wanted to just.
I think we were all spooked by the DPR question, the right to withdraw data and all, like we were. I think further into the thought process, like that kind of idea, thinking about the right to withdraw data, right? And how far down the line does it go? And then do you retrieve the raw data from foundational model? I think there are ways to say, okay, well, again, the consent says it's not, if it's been used and we're going to stop that point. I think there's this, you can sever the link between the sample analysis and then your foundational model data. There might be ways, technical ways to do that, and that you don't need to go back. Like you don't have that link to the participants, although data needs to be
But could I ask a more basic question? Like, a lot of the data now is controlled access, the raw data at least. Can you build a foundational model off of that controlled access data?
Yeah.
Very unclear, right? I mean, it depends on, we're entering a world that it'll, I think it's the same with the data that's been collected over the last decade from clinical trials, there are constraints that were put in the language and how that data can be used that are open to different interpretations, and whether they can be used for secondary analyses that's somehow independent of it.
Yeah.
No,
Well, there are sites for that. There's two sites that I know of. One is Verily and the other is in the Welcome, something clinical data portal, where there's scrubbed data put there by the companies after the clinical trial is finished for anyone to have access to. That's the only two kind of places where I know that occurs for access to clinical data following the end of the trial.
yeah, I think Ed's question was a bit different. It's if you ask a data access committee for access to part of the human brain atlas, and the access committee says, yes, does it? But if I want to use that data, put it in a foundational model that might be proprietary to a company that you could then resell as a product for something else, or I could make it available as a model to the whole community. Am I allowed to do that? So if, even in an academic lab, I was an academic lab, I took data, I've asked permission, can I make a foundational model based on that data available to the entire community? Given that I've had to ask permission to access that data in the first place, or can I only build a foundational model on data that is per se always going to be open? I don't think that's a whole.
That's a good one. That's a good one. Any other, we're stopping at 12.
Noted.
Any other questions for our committee? No, if you wait us down, thank you, John.
Sorry.
Great question, great question. Other issues that you've encountered? Some of them can be even tissue specific. I know that people working in the pediatric often have specific limitations, but developmental, as we call it, which is usually fetal and embryonic tissues, I know are a hot topic right now, especially in the United States.
Wait, could I ask a question? In the US, we've held the line on open access to raw sequence.
Pardon?
Is it in the US, we're holding the line on open access to raw sequence data? It's consented that way. And in the Brain Initiative efforts, all the tissue banks have instituted a consenting that allows that to happen. With the EU as an example, what happens if that changes tomorrow and we have all this data that's in open access databases and has been used by many people?
I would say that it's the consent at the time it was consented to. The person, I mean, the consents are generally pretty for open access. When the IRB reviews it, it's like they'll do a thorough review and it has to be clear that it's open, risks involved, etc. So I think in terms of governance, you have a solid basis to say like it was consented for open access. It's gone, the data is distributed, right? The question is like whether they're going to ask you then to like your IRB would say, okay, well now you have to make it controlled. But I mean, what you have at the time is it was open, it was distributed as open. I think that would be then become an IRB discussion question as to whether
I was just wondering about like data retraction or any of these.
Well,
issues like
if
that.
something like that happened, suddenly from open to close, post consent and so on, you'd have to have a pretty valid reason, really scientifically valid reason, because you would be negating the original consent. You're putting the data altruism and the consent of all those who wanted to contribute. You would be denying them their right to participate in science and the freedom of science. I mean, I would probably take a reference case to the Supreme Court. Yeah, I mean, I'm a believer in open science, so that to me would be the most wrongful distrust with your participants to do something like that to their data or their samples just like scientists who sit on it, who have the consents and who have it and then don't do anything with it. That also really, it's
I mean, it's not unheard of, but however, a lot of databases would be in a difficult situation at that point.
Yeah. Any other issues? I think that this going back, conversion and so on is something, and also the potential from a scientific point of view or from a re-identification point of view, you might one day have to face being more restrictive in access, because it wasn't imagined that 30 years ago that X could be done with it, and proper governance might indicate a more conservative approach, which you could justify to maintain the trust of your participants, which is really important. But other than that, so the future, some of these futuristic issues we can look at. Dear, anything else from anyone? Ethics Rodrigue, any last words?
No, I think that there are a couple of issues that have arisen here that are worth for you to consider.
Yeah, and Fabiana's point as well, I think is also well taken. And I think we do need to re-examine benefit sharing as being seen not only as some sort of financial return. There are many other ways of recognizing participants that could be part of the benefit sharing model, not just the commercial transactional model, as I call it.
I would say that if any of these questions do come up during the year, email us, the ethics working group. I think we're working on, so now we have this suite of tools, but then how are they working and how, do they not work in certain areas? Are there issues in certain jurisdictions it could be, or like groups? So we do want to know about this, and we do want to refine the tools just to make sure that we're keeping up with how the atlas is going.
Yeah, and one thing that came, I don't know if we'll look at this, but listening to the first speaker today and the avatars and the organoids and in the very sensitive area of embryo research and fetal research, or even synthetic, as you know, embryos and so on. is that one way that HCA scientists in that very important developmental field will be able to still move forward in their field without hitting all the political, legal, and moral and religious roadblocks that exist right now for that very important area of research? I don't have the answer to that. And it does come up. I mean, Germany is changing their 1990 Embryo Protection Act this moment. So their countries are looking at this. And as I mentioned, South Africa prohibited beneficiary in terms of human genetic research. So I think, Emily, are we okay, we're all right. So I wanted to thank everyone for coming, and ethics working group is not meant to be a scary place, for scary issues. We're never bored. You're welcome to participate. We have members who half our members are I'm not a bona fide ethicist myself. So we need scientists, because if we're not grounded in the reality of which we work with, it's not real. It's not real work. So thanks everyone, and we'll see you downstairs. Thanks Emily and Alex and our note taker.